Greetings. I'm meeting you at my door and shaking your hand as I would if you came to my classroom. I miss you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. On Monday, you should have watched a video titled How to Analyze a Poem in 6 Easy Steps. Today, I'm going to model for you using the Big Six how to analyze a specific poem titled Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. Our agenda is this. We will, that means you will, take notes, take screen prints, and annotate the poem in Word Online as the teacher models for us how to use the Big Six to analyze a poem by Billy Collins. By the end, you will fill in the blank and write out what I found from my findings at the bottom of the Big Six. You'll finish this sentence stem. After analyzing the element of, I'm going to do theme. You can do any of the other 6, okay? But I'm going to do theme, so you can't do that one. I found, and you will tell me what you discovered. Pick any of the Big Six elements, but not the one that I modeled for you again. Okay, so step 1. Read the poem silently and then aloud. All right? So what I want you to do after each slide, you will pause so you can take notes. But first, you're going to take the moment now to pause the video, read the poem silently to yourself, and then once out loud. And then you will hit play again to continue to hear me read it, and then we will watch a video of Billy Collins reading it himself. All right, go ahead and pause the video now to read the poem. Hi, welcome back. Introduction to Poetry. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie a poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
So now that we've read the poem silently and out loud, and we've listened to the author read it and me read it, now we're going to look at the Big Six first. We've already read the poem, and now we're going to practice doing the other steps together. And this is what the graphic organizer looks like. And if you look down here at the bottom where it says My Findings, this is the sentence you should be able to create by the end of class today. After analyzing the Big Six element of, and then you'd pick one, title, paraphrase, speaker, turns. I'm doing themes, so you can't pick that one. Or tools such as you could say imagery, or images, or metaphors, or personification. So you could do that as well. So step 2, consider the title. I know lots of students want to skip the title, but the title really is important if one does exist. It is important. All right, so what words, ideas appear in other places in the poem? Now, the title has Introduction to Poetry. The other words that are similar to poetry is poem and poems, right? And you see that the author uses the word poem, poems, or poetry, including with the title 6 times in the poem itself. So that means poem, poetry is important to this. The idea that is popular in this specific poem is that people struggle with understanding or grasping poetry, right? And the other idea that's repeated is he asks them, or he says, or he wants, right? He says, I. That's repeated, right? He asks them to do something with a poem, right? Is the title a line in the poem? Not in this one at all, right? And what does the title highlight, right? Introduction to Poetry is the title. It seems to highlight the idea that the speaker is a teacher or a professor, because that sounds like the name of an actual class in college. I actually took an Introduction to Poetry class in college, right? And he's speaking to his class of students, right? Does the title immediately change how you think about the poem? Well, yes. At first I thought it would be introducing me to poetic elements, but instead it suggested how to enjoy poetry instead, and that was actually rather enlightening for me. Does the poem's title paint a picture that gives a specific time frame, setting, or action? For me, it painted a picture of a professor speaking to his students in a college classroom. And for some reason, maybe it's because the poet himself was male, I saw this professor as male. All right. Does the title imply possibilities? Yes. And if you look over here, I imagine learning more about poetry overall, but I learned more about how others see poetry instead. Step 3, understanding the speaker. You can't not skip over the speaker. Speaker is very important in poetry. First, what is the speaker like? He appears to be a teacher or a professor speaking to his or her class. This seems evident by the title. And when he says, I ask them to, I say, drop, I want them to, these are all highlighted. And remember, Introduction to Poetry sounds like the name of a college course. What does he or she love, hate, fear, etc.? The speaker seems to love poetry, but hates the way others view it or overanalyze it or overcomplicate it. This is evident in the last 2 stanzas when he talks about torturing it. What is the speaker's attitude toward the subject? Well, the subject is poetry, right? He enjoys poetry, but he despises how his audience, the students, professors, people in general, feel about it, because he feels they do not understand it or they overcomplicate it. Does the poem give any clues about the speaker's personality, point of view, age, or gender? Well, first off, the first 5 stanzas of the poem, he says I. He uses the I, first person point of view. At the end, he then turns to they, but it's still him speaking in his point of view about how they see things, right? Although the title portrays a rather scholastic or didactic tone, which means a teaching tone, the speaker seems like a pretty cool dude as a teacher, professor, because he doesn't use words like analyze or explicate the poem, but instead he asks us to look at a poem in rather weird or strange ways, which are highlighted in blue over here. I mean, he asks us to hold it up to a light, like a color slide, to press our ear against it, to hear it, to drop a mouse into it, to, walk inside its walls, to water ski across the surface. Those are strange ways for a professor to ask us to look at a poem. So that makes him the cool dude, right? Who is the speaker addressing? Who is the audience? Seems like the speaker is addressing his students, right? Does the speaker seem attached, fond of, affectionate towards, or detached, which means disconnected from, right, what is being said? He appears attached because he appears to feel an affection towards his subject of poetry. but not for his audience. This is where he becomes more detached in the last two stanzas. Step 4. Consider the mood and the tone. How does the author's attitude make you, the audience, feel? So what is the attitude each speaker or character gives? Well, there's one speaker here. He enjoys poetry, but he despises how his audience, the students, the professors, etc., feel about it because he feels they do not understand it or they overcomplicate poetry. So syntax, as mentioned previously, is how the words and the phrases are arranged in the poem, right? So what type of syntax is used in this poem and what effect do certain words have on us? It is a free verse poem. That means it doesn't really rhyme, all right? Of 16 lines made up of 7 stanzas. There is no set rhyme scheme. The meter is irregular, but 1 or 2, actually 3 specific lines bring the familiar iambic rhythm into the play. These are highlighted in green. Let's look at them. Line 4, or press an ear against its hive. And then line 7, or walk inside the poem's room. And then finally the last line, line 16, to find out what it really means. See how it has that nice rhythm, iambic pentameter, right? Are there places where the poem's tone may switch, shift, or turn, and why? All right, the poem shifts right here, and you can see where I put the red line, right? That's at line 12 in stanza 6 with the words but. Anytime you hear the word but, you're about to hear a shift, all right? But all they want to do is, all right, a total shift here, all right? Why is he shifting here? Well, he's going from what he said and how he feels and how he wants people to look at poetry to how people actually look at it. They overcomplicate it. They overanalyze it. They torture a poem to death. All right? What is the tone at the beginning of the poem and then at the end? Right? At the beginning, the speaker's attitude or tone appears rather didactic, intended to teach. It's a subtle instruction, an appeal to the more sensitive, even playful side of human nature. However, the tone changes negatively in the last 2 stanzas, to accusation. The speaker strongly asserts that all they, the readers, the teachers, the students, the other professors, lecturers, whatever you want to call them, all they do is harm poetry by restricting it, doing nasty things to it in hope that they will find answers and meaning. They overcomplicate it, they overanalyze it rather than enjoying it for what it is. Step 5. Step 5 is paraphrase of the poem. This will take up 2 slides because first I'm going to line by line paraphrase the poem in my own words. And then on the next slide, we're going to look at the big ideas or the big images that stand out. And overall, we're going to get a story of what is actually happening in the poem. All right? So we're first going to start with the title, Introduction to Poetry. The title, the professor is teaching a class introducing poetry. Right? Now the first stanza. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide. My paraphrase, see a real picture, a poem in real light equals understanding. Let it be your own experience. When you bring it into the light, you're bringing it into understanding, right? Or press an ear against its hive. Referring to a beehive, that's the metaphor, right? But listen to the rhythm and the sounds of the poem. That's what he's talking about, right? I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. He's saying be like a mouse, getting to the cheese, right? We can get to the heart of the poem by not giving up, by feeling it, by exploring it, right? Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. Again, we're referring back to the light, right? Understanding. Visualize being lost in the darkness and then coming out of the darkness into the light. You will find light. You will find understanding when you can relate it to your own experiences, right? I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. Have fun with the poem. Enjoy it. Take note of the poet, but the poet's not that important. It's the experience of the poem itself, right? And then finally, the last two stanzas. But all they want to do is tie a poem to a chair with rope and torture confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. But, he says, most people, teachers, professors, and students, harm poetry by restricting it, doing nasty things to it in the hope that they will find answers and meaning. They overanalyze it, they overcomplicate it, they make it so difficult for them to understand instead of experiencing it with their own experiences. Again, still step 5 of the paraphrase, but what are the big ideas, the big images that stand out? All right, so what poetic devices are being used most frequently? We have imagery, we have personification, and we have metaphors that are being used, right? Personification I have over here in the green. We have 2 instances of them. Personification is when the author gives human characteristics to inanimate objects or things that are, of course, not human, all right? So here he says, the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. Poems don't wave, people do. And then they tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. Of course, a poem, you cannot torture a confession out of a poem, right? That's something you would do, God forbid, to a human, right? And then there are 3 different types of imagery, right? We have 1, exploration, which is in the blue. That's when the author is asking us to explore the poem, right? And then 2, fun, which is in the yellow. And then the 3rd one is torture, which is in red at the bottom. So let's look at the exploration images. So in the first line, he asks us to hold the poem up to a light like a color slide, right? The speaker asks us to take a visual exploration of the poem. And then the next line, he asks us to press an ear against his hive. The speaker asks us to take an auditory, which means hear, right? He's asking us to hear. Take an auditory exploration of the poem. Let's hear the rhythms. Let's hear it, right? And then finally, we see these 2 right here where they're exploratory, but they're more physical. Drop a mouse into a poem. It's like that maze. That's also a metaphor, by the way, where he says he compares the actual poem to a maze. Collins emphasizes how complex and incredible a poem can be, right? And he also asks us to walk inside the poem, take that physical exploration ourselves, right? And feel around the walls, to turn on the light so that we can understand. What devices repeat or create a consistent image within the poem? We have light. We see this twice. It's repeated in stanzas 1 and in stanza 4. Light equals transparency, ease of understanding. So we see light here and we see light here. All right. Then torture, right? That's the entire last 2 stanzas of the poem, right? Its imagery is extended through the last 2 stanzas, opposing the light. Torture is dark, right? They make this dark, and they make reading a poem difficult and understanding a poem difficult when we should be in the light of understanding. It's opposite. They're juxtaposed, okay? Finally, step 6, which is theme. What are the big universal ideas addressed in this poem? The first one, I break it down to two themes. It is a sense of adventure and exploration that the speaker wants to instill in the students when they look at the poems. And you see this in the blue. He says, I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light. That's that visual exploration, right? Or press an ear against his hive. Listen to it, hear it, right? And then he says, I drop a mouse in a poem like a maze and watch him probe. And then physically walk inside the poem's room and feel that's that physical journey that we're taking, right? We're feeling it, we're seeing it, we're hearing it. And might I even say like a mouse getting to the cheese, or maybe even tasting it, all right? And then the next one, the reader should enjoy poetry, have fun with it, instead of overanalyzing it in an attempt to find its meaning. That's in the yellow. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. He wants us to have fun. Can you just see it? Can you smell it? I can smell sunscreen and hot dogs right now because we're either at a beach or on a lake and feel the sand, right? He wants us to explore this, to feel this, right? How are they presented? Think tone and imagery. As previously stated, the speaker's tone, although didactic, as if teaching, all right, he comes across more as the cool professor trying to teach an appreciation for poetry rather than how to overanalyze it. On the previous slide, we noticed that the speaker uses 3 different types of imagery, one of which was exploration, which was visual and auditory and even physical, right? The speaker wants us to explore, have fun with poetry rather than analyze or explicate it. So now we're back to the big 6, right? We just did all of these. You're going to be looking at my findings after analyzing the big 6 element of blank. I found blank. You're going to choose one. So here's my teacher model. All right. My findings after analyzing the element of theme. I found that the speaker wants us to explore and enjoy reading poetry. Now it's your turn. Pick any of the big 6 elements: speaker, tone, tone shifts, imagery, title, figurative language, poetic devices, paraphrase, theme. You can even break it down to metaphors, imagery, personification, but not the one I just modeled for you on the left, right? Which was theme. Now, you will fill in the blank and write out what you found for my findings at the bottom of the big 6. After analyzing the element of blank, I found blank. All right? I'm looking forward to reading your sentences and see what you discovered. Adios. Until next time.